because now I'm down to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to talk real quick because I don't have to worry about the translators. So I come at this just transitions material through a legal lens. I first got involved in this just transitions uh, scholarship when I was part of a project out of York University called Work in a Warming World. And I was asked to get involved. I was asked to put my name on the application for this big grant by Carla Lipsick-Mame, who was running it. And I said, I don't know anything about climate and work. And she said, oh, nobody does. So I put my name down and she got the grant. And then she came to me and said, you got to write something now. And so I had to write something about labor law and climate change. So when I started to look around at what legal scholars had written about climate change, I found that basically the answer was nothing. There were no legal labor law scholars looking at climate at all back in like 2014, 2015. So I had to write something. So I wrote a paper that I called Just Transitions Law, Putting Labor Law to Work on Climate Change. And then what I did in that paper was like a thought exercise. We took this idea of a just transition and we turned it into legal law and policy. What would we come up with? So for example, if I created a course called Just Transitions Law, or I wrote a textbook called Just Transitions Law, what would be in the book? What would I teach? How do we know a just transition law when we meet one? And what would be the normative lens through which we look at this material? In other words, what's the just part of it? And so that's what I wrote about in that paper. And then back then, as I said, there weren't many people writing about this. But we knew this audience will know that the phrase just transitions law came out originally from the labor movement in the 1970s and the 1980s. And it had a very narrow concept. It was basically the idea that as we transition towards a cleaner, greener economy, that we should take account of the fact that fossil fuel workers are going to lose their jobs. Fossil fuel communities are going to lose their economic engine. And so when we thought about what just transition means through that lens, it wasn't that difficult to imagine the sorts of policies we would be interested in. And so when Canada launched a federal task force on just transition in 2019, its focus was entirely on coal workers and coal communities. And when it's understood, when we understand just transition through this idea of the displacement of fossil fuel workers, we end up with sort of a list of policies that come out of these sorts of studies that, again, it's pretty easy to see the direction from point A to point B. We're getting rid of coal mines. We therefore should look after coal miners, and what sorts of things would we do that with? And so we end up talking about a set of policies, and I've heard discussion about these sorts of policies in an earlier panel today, and probably we'll hear again. We're talking about how could law help displaced coal miners and coal miners communities, law and policy. Okay. And so when we're talking about communities, we're talking about maybe giving money preference in funding to try and create green industry jobs in the communities where the coal mines were. And the Alberta government took that approach a few years ago. They gave out millions of dollars in subsidies for business proposals to help create green energy jobs in coal mining towns. Okay, so in the earlier paper, I ended up with sort of this hypothetical textbook called Just Transitions Law, the table of contents. What would it cover? And it would have a sort of a theory of justice, which would be labor justice. This idea of we need to help displaced fossil fuel workers. And then it would have a section on the law of transitions. So all of the types of law that would help us encourage the transition away from fossil fuels to greener energy. And then it would have a section on the justice part. How would we use law to help these displaced workers? And it would end up with something like this. And what you end up with is an exercise in sort of looking around the legal landscape and grabbing all of those laws out there, contract law, property law, administrative law, land use law. We grab all the parts of it that we think are relevant to a just transition, bring it in, and we create a new legal discipline called just transitions law, just like we did with labor law, right? Labor law was a combination of property and criminal and contracts. We grabbed it all, we put it under a new heading called labor law, and suddenly we have a new discipline called legal labor law. Same with environmental law, same process. Well, I was just doing this hypothetical exercise. Let's call this just transitions law and figure out what law is part of that. Okay. Now, what's happened in the interim, say in the last decade, since I first started to look at this, is that the idea of a just transition has expanded broadly. It's been co opted by a whole bunch of other uh, fields, fields of academic fields. So while labor people, the sorts of people who come to CRIMPT, have been focusing in on an idea of just transition that is about protecting displaced workers and communities, there are other fields of study out there at different conferences in different cities talking about just transitions in a completely different way. And in fact, they are not talking about displaced fossil fuel workers at all. Their idea of just transition is something completely different. For example, if you look at environmental justice literature and go to environmental justice conferences, you will find that they are focusing on just transition through a lens of racial discrimination. Right? For them, it's not about protecting coal miners. It's about redressing past wrongs from a racial dimension. If you look at migration justice advocates, they are describing just transition as an argument to ensure immigration law and policy is utilized to protect displaced people who are going to be displaced because of climate change. And then there are some people who use just transitions now in association with the grand reset, right? About the creation of a brand new economic and social order that pursues economic fairness and justice for people everywhere, right? So this idea that just transition is about a just transition for fossil fuel workers is a very narrow idea that this crowd talks about, but there's a lot else going on. So in a couple of recent publications, I've been thinking about this, right? This idea of contested boundaries of just transitions law. I have just a blog. If you're interested in this stuff and you don't want to read a whole paper, there's a little blog entry on the Law and Political Economy blog. And then I have a chapter in a book with Ann Eisenberg, who's from, she moved recently, but West Virginia law. In a textbook called Ecology, Labor Law and Ecology. Okay, and so what I'm interested in now is this idea that if just transition is no longer just about justice for displaced fossil fuel workers, but it's in fact what just transition means now is something much broader, an all-encompassing idea um, for fundamentally altering the society and economy, then we get into this concern about whether if it means everything to everyone, does it mean anything at all? Right? Is it losing its value as a concept? Um, and certainly, if you look at just transitions through these other lenses, um, you can see how fundamentally it changes the discussion, right? So if in the labor justice field, we're concerned about displaced workers, but in almost any other of these fields, the idea that mostly white male unionized fossil fuel workers should be preferenced in terms of resources and opportunities uh, is arguably considered absurd, right? In other words, and actually looking at it through the lens of displaced fossil fuel workers, all of these other arguments here, environmental justice, energy justice, intergenerational justice, they are concerned about different people. They are saying, for example, communities of color didn't tend to get those jobs, those nice paying unionized coal miner jobs. So why would we, in our terms of how to just transition to a new economy, be prioritizing the privileged white men who lost their coal mining jobs? Why wouldn't we, if we're going to reset, go after the people that were never able to get those jobs in the first place. And so it's a completely different view, and you have conflicting ideas of justice. Okay, and what am I at now? 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to move along here. I'm just right to my last slide here because I really just want to make. I don't have any answers to any of this, by the way. I just pose questions, right? But what I'm trying to get at, encouraging a dialogue and maybe like a conference. If I can get Dimitris Stevis here, who's like the godfather of this field, who's coming up here. Uh, you know, we need a conference that isn't just crimped labor people talking about just transitions through a labor justice lens. It's just transitions writ large, where we invite people from all these other disciplines into a room and we try and sort out, what does just transitions writ large mean? What is the guiding principle? What is the normative lens? If we are going to create a field or think about just transition as something broadly conceived, where there are all of these competing justice narratives, uh, how do we decide amongst them? Who decides? Who's at the table? Right now, if I create my just transitions law textbook through this much larger concept of just transitions, what's in it? I know for one thing, it's a much, much bigger book, right? It's no longer focused primarily on what we understand as labor and employment law. It now has all of these other fields involved as well, right? And it's a fascinating project, right, to bring people in from all of these different disciplines, because we don't tend to do that, right? I published my journal article, Just Transitions Law, deliberately in an environmental law journal, because one of the points I was making is we don't talk to each other, right? Labor law people are in labor law conferences, and environmental law people and climate law people, we don't talk to each other. And so what happens is, each one of these little boxes, this year there's a conference at each one of them where there are panels on just transitions, and I can guarantee you hardly any of them are talking about what we're talking about. They're talking about just transition with a completely different meaning. And we need to get together and think about how we're going to move. We can just ignore them and say that's our idea. This is a labor idea and we're going to stick to it. Or, and maybe there's reasons to do that, right? Or we could say the horse is out of the stable now. Just transition has taken on a much different meaning than what it originally meant, and we need to struggle with how we're going to deal with it, right? What does a ministry of just transitions do if it's dealing with all of these things, as opposed to just being concerned about fossil fuel workers who are losing their jobs? And I'll stop there.